Hi, everyone. Sorry about that little bit of a delay here in getting started. This is our first attempt using the full version of YouTube Live instead of the YouTube Live Hangouts on Air option. And we had accidentally created two separate events in our YouTube account, and we were broadcasting to the wrong event. So sorry about that, but we're here now, and we're ready to get going. My name is Ryan Boyd, and I'm on the developer relations team here at Neo4j. And I'm going to give you a tour of the Neo4j Sandbox and talk a little bit about how we built the Neo4j Sandbox environment. If you guys search the web for Neo4j Sandbox, you should be able to find it pretty easily there. It's neo4j.com/sandbox if you choose to access it directly. So the first thing that I want to do is actually give you a demo of the sandbox. And in my demo of the sandbox, I'm just going to show you what it looks like from an end user experience. And so you'll get a quick shot of my email, and then we'll go over to the sandbox here. And let me see, I can probably say enter full screen here to get you the full view. But this is the Neo4j Sandbox. So again, visit neo4j.com/sandbox, or you can put the -v2 if you want. But and the Neo4j Sandbox allows you to get started with Neo4j using a variety of different use cases. And these use cases each have their own data sets and guides that go along with them. So I'm going to get started quickly, and then we're going to go into the features during the presentation here. But I get to choose what account I want to log in with. So let's log in with my Twitter account right now. We'll see if I have any sandboxes up and running with that. I do not. But I'm giving these different options for starting Sandbox. The first one is the fundamentals training course. You guys won't see that. We'll talk about the kind of feature for hidden sandboxes here shortly. But then these others here are ones that you will see. So we're going to launch a sandbox for recommendations. And this was built by our colleague, Will Lyon, who's actually sitting with me here in the studio and is going to be running our Q&A here today. And Will built this sandbox to really guide you through every step of creating a recommendation engine based off of Neo4j. So I started up that sandbox. I'll introduce you a little bit to the tabs at the top here. Get Started has our link to the browser. Details has some further links, as well as the port numbers and IP addresses and things like that. The data model is what it is. It's the data model of the data. This recommendations engine example uses data from a movie data set, but we added some additional things beyond the standard Neo4j movie data set in order to make it work for recommendations. And there's also code here, and this code you can copy and paste. At the top is instructions for installing the various libraries, depending on what language you choose here. But this code actually has your password and IP address and bolt port and all in it. But I'm going to get started. I'm just going to go into the Neo4j browser here. And in the Neo4j browser, we're going to see this is a standard Neo4j instance, as you guys are probably all familiar with, but it also has this built-in guide by default here. And this guide is what we'll put a lot of time and energy into, introducing you to the different types of recommendation engines, content-based filtering, collaborative filtering, and it goes through and gives you Cypher queries that you can execute just by clicking on them, and you can see the results right away. So encourage you to check out the sandbox, in particular the recommendations engine one that Will built. The other one that I particularly like for those people who are fans of Twitter is we have a live streaming version of the Twitter sandbox here. And so you guys might have been familiar with my Graph Your Network application, which did a similar version, but this is a lot better. So I'd encourage you to check it out. If you sign in with your Twitter account to the sandbox and you launch this particular sandbox, what happens is it creates a Neo4j database, but then creates a separate Docker container that is a process that streams data from Twitter into the graph. And you can see it's already there for me if I look at a bunch of tweets here. and we can see here all the tweets and what are retweets and that sort of thing. So the data has already started to flow in, and we'll keep on streaming it in using the Twitter streaming APIs as long as your sandbox lasts, which right now is 3 days, although you can provide some additional information about your use cases for Neo4j and extend that through a full 10 days. The other use cases here are around data journalism, looking at the connections between Trump and the various cabinet members, as well as looking at congressional legislation and things like that. So encourage you all to check out the sandbox. Most of this discussion is not going to be from an end user standpoint, but from the requirements that we had to build the sandbox, and how we build it and things that we learned along the way. And so I'm going to hop over here into my presentation. And so first of all, I want to give a shout out. Thanks to the AWS folks for tweeting out this online meetup, as well as the Auth0 folks and FullContact folks. Greatly appreciate it. We love to keep on building the community of graphistas. And so thanks, folks. We did build on a lot of different technologies. So I'm going to go through the whole technology stack. But first of all, I want to say we're going to have a Q&A session. And we're going to have that Q&A session after I go through the intro here, and then you can reach out to me afterwards, though, at RyGuyRG on Twitter or ryan@neo4j.com. Did we have any questions that came in, Will, from the initial demo, or are we all set to just kind of dive into the presentation?
Yeah, so we have one question here from Chris, and he asks, can we contribute to sandboxes in adding our own use cases? Is that something we...
Thanks, Will, and thanks, Chris. We'll get into that. That is something that we would like to encourage in the future. We don't have it quite ready yet, but you can get started for when we do have that ready, and I'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. All right, so let's get into the presentation here. Again, my name is RyGuyRG, or that's my Twitter handle. That's what I'm referred to on the internet. At one time, I enjoyed skydiving. I now have a young baby, and my partner, Marissa, does not like me going skydiving. So not doing skydiving anymore, but I want to give you a little bit of my background and set some context here for why the sandbox was built. So I developed web applications and APIs for 5 years when I was out of college. While I was in college, I ended up, working mostly full time, actually, doing similar type of work. But then I graduated, spent 5 years. Then I led developer relations teams at Google for 8 years. And I wrote an O'Reilly book on OAuth 2.0. And this isn't like, my brag session. But what I wanted to get the point across is, what do these things have in common? These different things that I did, I wrote a book on OAuth. I worked at Google and I developed APIs and web apps. Well, here's the kind of overlap here. It's a Venn diagram. Everything in this world is a graph, and everything in this world is also a Venn diagram. The Venn diagram may not be overlapping, I guess, in some cases. But and what these have in common is the web. And if you excuse me here, I'm going to grab my coffee. Hopefully all of you like Phil's. It's wonderful coffee. But all of these things have the web in common with them. So what does that mean? Well, I came to Neo4j, and Neo4j was fancy and awesome, really modern looking, but there was this download button. There was this download button for downloading the product. We distribute Neo4j as a downloadable product, and my gut reaction was, huh? I came from this environment of working on the web and working on other sort of, cloud-based technologies. And I didn't quite get the concept of a download button. So an important life lesson for me, at least, is download is a bad word. So we want to swipe left on download. And why is download a bad word? I shouldn't curse. is it actually really bad? Well, I set out to test that. That was some of the first videos here I did at Neo, is setting out to test whether download was a bad word. So my gut reaction to download is that when you click on that button, you're going to be spending the next day installing and configuring an application or a product, especially when you're downloading a server-side product, not just like a desktop application. So I set out to prove that wrong, and I successfully proved it wrong. I managed to download Neo4j, get it up and running on my local machine, and get into the web browser in 59 seconds. And you can see that video. There's a little before and after, so the total video length is 1:21, but it only took 59 seconds from the point of downloading to getting it up and running. But there's still a stigma around the word download. There are still people like myself who are going to see that word and are not going to want to take any action because they think it will take too long. And so it is important for us to solve this stigma. And so we wanted to look at the download versus a sandbox. So Neo4j sandbox environment, we put these two buttons side by side. I actually haven't looked at the performance of this since we launched, but we want to know how these things compare, both from a user experience as well as from this perception, as well as whether people get started quickly with the sandbox versus with a download, or more likely to start their experience with Neo4j. So here's our agenda here today. We're going to first talk about goals for the Neo4j sandbox. We're going to talk about our stakeholders and the risks associated with the sandbox. We're then going to talk about the solution that we built, the tech stack that it is part of, or that it's built on, the architecture, and then talk about some lessons learned and what's up next. And of course, we're going to have a Q&A at the end, so hold your questions, ask them on Slack. Will take a look and pass them to me at the end. We'll hopefully get as many answered as we can. Otherwise, again, reach out to me on Twitter or email. So let's get into goals. First of all, my primary goal, and this differs a little bit in the past. So this is Sandbox V2, as some of you may have noticed. There was a V1 of the Sandbox, which had different sets of goals, and I'll talk about those. But my primary goal, which was different from V1, is a fast onboard experience. And how did I hope to achieve that? Well, the original version of the Sandbox had this lead gen form. Users are going to run away from a lead gen form. There was like 10 different fields there. And so, it's actually, the conversion rate wasn't terribly good as people landed on the Sandbox landing page on the original version with that lead gen form. And very few people actually filled out that form and got started. So that was one thing that I wanted to start by solving, by providing this great onboarding experience. But I also wanted to have data that users care about and a guided experience through that data and a guided experience through the Neo4j product. And I'm okay offering a guided experience that may be even slightly better than the product. Because the product has different goals in mind, right? So this is meant to be a sandbox and demo environment. The product has goals in mind that is, a lot around stability and performance. And so there's a few different things that we can do. And I haven't really started doing many of these, but you'll see these over time. Michael Hunger has built this great little JavaScript bookmark, I guess. And the JavaScript bookmark allows you to see different views of your data responses from Neo4j in the Neo4j browser. So you can see charts, you can see different types of tables that are filterable and sortable and things like that. So I'm going to look at injecting some of that type of stuff into the browser in the sandbox, while also telling people, hey, this is something that we're trying out. and it's not actually in the real full product, but we'd love to get your feedback on it. So we're going to continue to use the sandbox for that sort of that sort of use case to test out how different features work for you, the users and developers who are building on it. And I also wanted to be very fast to the first line of code that you write, whether that be a line of code of Cypher, the declarative query language for graphs, or whether that be a line of code in Java or Python or JavaScript or .NET as you're interacting with Neo4j. And I also wanted an isolated environment. I wanted an environment where you could feel free to play around and you wouldn't worry about impacting other users. And Docker helped us achieve that in this case. So those were my main goals. Now let's talk about the stakeholders. Who am I building this for? Obviously, I'm building this for users. The users come first. But, internally, I get my paycheck from somewhere. And Emil, our lovely CEO, signs it probably quite virtually, or signs the ACH transfer virtually. But I get my paycheck. And so I have stakeholders that I'm building this application for to reach our Neo4j goals that we just discussed. So the CEO, Emil, I just referred to, signs the paychecks. He wants everyone to use the product. In his ideal world, you wouldn't even have to log into the sandbox. You could just jump right in and start using Neo4j. We'll talk about why we can't do that and the risks, but anyway, his primary goal is to have everyone use the product. Marketing, on the other hand, wants to be able to reach the users. They want to be able to send messages to the users in the future as we have new events like the upcoming Graph Connect Europe, or as we have new various resources available, new editions of the O'Reilly book and things along those lines. So that's very important for marketing. But I'd be kidding myself if I said it wasn't important for us as well. So developer relations, is split-brained. It's half marketing, half engineering. There's a bunch of other roles that are mixed in there as well. But, we do need to think about it from the marketing perspective. So if I'm being true to myself, I want to be able to reach users as well. And I want to be able to reach users for different reasons. I want to be able to get their feedback. I also want them to go to events and build the community and talk at meetups and talk at conferences and things like that. But so we have slightly different goals, but I do want to be able to reach the users of the sandbox. So those are our key stakeholders and the key different kind of issues at play here. Now, what are the risks? When we're going into building the sandbox, what are we worried about? Well, the primary thing that we're first worried about is how much money is it going to cost? We're giving everyone their own isolated Neo4j environment. How do we lower the costs? And that is lowering the fixed costs. So we have to have machines that are ready to serve users. To give you guys an idea, over the last 24 hours, we had somewhere around 130 different people come into the sandbox and launch a sandbox. And many of them launched more than one. But this was kind of a spike in traffic as we promoted this meetup. There are over 500 sandboxes running live right now on AWS for developers like yourself. And so that kind of represents the variable costs. So we have these fixed costs, which is, we have to always have machines that are ready to serve users, that have capacity to serve users. And that means having machines ready to run Docker images on it. And then we have variable costs. If we extend beyond those kind of machines that we always have running and we get a lot of users like we have right now, there are costs as we increase our number of users. Another risk is sort of around data quality and potential for low data quality. So the original Sandbox login form asked for a variety of information from users: the name, the company, the country, the state, the business email. And so we are worried that we're not going to get good information about the users by having sort of that very slick onboarding experience that you saw. And that worry has turned out not to be very true. We have some little tweaks to do, but we can use data provided by the OAuth providers, and we can use data provided by folks like FullContact. And folks like MaxMind, and we'll talk about those later. But we can use a variety of different data providers in addition to the data that we get from the user logging in. Also, we're a little bit worried about whether the stickiness would be good. You're getting a 3-day sandbox, you're getting a 7-day sandbox or a 10-day sandbox, depending on whether you extend or not. And this sandbox has a limited lifetime by its nature. We can't keep these up and running forever. And while if you download the product, you always have it on your machine. Currently, our downloads, when you install it, doesn't install it as a service by default. So I'm a little bit less worried about this, but it is still something for us to keep an eye on. So also really worried about operational nightmares. My job is in developer relations. We do have an IT team here, and I can plug that they're hiring for the Bay Area. I think a level 1 help desk person, as well as someone that can get interested in using Neo4j. But we don't have a full-time IT team working on the sandbox. This is me and Will and Michael. And it's just a handful of us. Mark over in the London team is starting to pick up on it as well. We have a couple new hires, but this is a potential problem for the sandbox. If it requires too much of our time to operationalize the sandbox, then it might not have a good ROI for us. And the things that we're worried about are server maintenance and security. How much time is that going to take? Scaling challenges, as we have spikes in load, do we accommodate them? If we have drops in load, do we accommodate them as well and lower our bills? So let's talk about the tech stack that we built. And that tech stack, there was a tweet I saw a few weeks ago, which was something like, once upon a time, all you needed to build an application was Java and AWT or Swing, or you just needed to build a web page. You just needed HTML. And nowadays, honestly, to build an application, you need a lot of different technologies to build an application that's like this. And so most of these I actually learned new as part of this project. So it made it a little bit slower going, but was very helpful for me to familiarize with the different technologies that are out there and available. And I do want to say I'm making some sort of risk comments and things like that, but overall it's been very sunny. Overall, operationally, things have just worked smoothly, and most of our risks have been heavily mitigated. So things are working out pretty well for the sandbox. And that's in part due to these technologies that I'm talking about. So some of these technologies add complexity to the system, but at the same time reduce the amount of time and energy we have to spend in the operational side. So our back end, the key technology there is Docker, wearing the Docker t-shirt, folks. Hopefully some folks from the Docker community have joined in. But Docker is the key technology here. It provides the level of isolation that we want. We assign specific amount of memory and CPU allocations to each user. And we do also isolate the data directories and other things. So every user gets their own Docker container for Neo4j, and that's very important to us. But we also needed to make these containers run on a platform that was very easy. And so we used the EC2 Container Service, which at one point I think was called the Elastic Container Service. And this is another critical part of our backend infrastructure. Every container that you launch, for every sandbox that you launch, is actually a task on ECS. And that task has a couple different Docker images in it, and we're going to see here what those are in the architecture later on. We also went serverless. This is a fad nowadays, of course. So I wanted to make sure that it was actually worth its name. And serverless has actually helped us a lot. So previous versions of these types of applications that I built, I was maintaining and operating my own server environments. Even if those were in the cloud, I was still dealing with the OS configuration and things like that. I have a lot of experience in sort of the serverless world. I worked on App Engine for a while. App Engine was probably the first super popular serverless environment where, when you launched an application, it could scale indefinitely to Google scale. One of the restrictions, though, on App Engine was to achieve that scale, you actually had a little bit less functionality that you could accommodate in your application. There were library restrictions, whitelist, blacklist, that sort of thing. The one thing that I really like about Lambda is we don't have those. So I can upload my own Python libraries, even that have compiled C in them, and those will run on AWS Lambda. So encourage you folks to check out Lambda. It's a lot of fun and very useful. And if you are in the Google ecosystem, I hear App Engine has actually launched support for Docker and have removed some of those sort of quote-unquote sandboxing restrictions that they had in the past. So that may be a great option for serverless as well, depending on the types of applications that you're building. And of course, I wanted to use Neo4j. Neo4j is an important part of the sandbox, both as an end user, but it also is our backend. It's where we store all of these sandboxes. And we store the information about the users and the sandboxes that they've launched and all of the enriched data that we get from different data sources. Python is my favorite language as of late, and so all of my Lambda functions are written in Python, so that's another critical part of our backend. And then we have authentication and authorization. We use OAuth here. You can see like this quote-unquote social sign-in uses OAuth, but I didn't want to have to implement, for those of you who are familiar with it, OAuth often differs provider to provider. The spec is pretty wide and allows you to have spec compliant implementations that are a little bit different provider to provider. So things like Auth0 and Okta and other environments allow you to actually have one API that you speak to those companies, and then they speak the various OAuth APIs to the providers like Google or Twitter or Facebook and things like that. So this was an important part of our backend to validate the user, authenticate and authorize them, but also our front end from a user experience perspective. And our Auth0 implementation is powered a lot by JOTs, or JSON Web Tokens. Basically, these are cryptographic tokens that look something like the background that you see here. And that is basically a set of data that is then signed by a key, and I can validate it. So this allows us to validate your authentication and some authorization data as well on the server side without calling external APIs. You can just validate it by validating the RSA signature on the token. It gets passed around. If you're curious, you can actually look in, when you log into the sandbox, you can look at your browser, your browser storage, local storage. You can look at your local storage and you can see the JOT for your account there. And that's what's used for the authentication and authorization. These time out, but we renew it automatically in the background through Auth0. I use some Bootstrap. Maybe a little bit old and dated to use Bootstrap, possibly. There's new fads. This used to be the fad, but it's really awesome and was very helpful in building this application and providing a UI. I'm not a designer, so I wanted a UI that actually looked somewhat good while also not being a designer. jQuery. The entire internet is powered by jQuery for the most part. John Resig, the creator of jQuery, is a big supporter of Neo4j. So shout out to the jQuery folks. Are we done with this yet? There's how many different technologies did I list here? Tons. No, we're not quite done. I did want to talk about data providers. So when you log in, we get some data from your OAuth provider. So in this case, data comes in through Auth0 from Google. If I log in with my Google account, very basic information, my name, my last name, a picture, gender information, and importantly, a verified email address. I know that Google has verified the email address. LinkedIn provides similar data. GitHub provides similar data. Twitter, etc. And then we have FullContact. And FullContact is what we supplement the data with in order to pass it on to the rest of our systems. So we needed to provide data that is as good as what people are filling out in those online forms. That existed prior to Sandbox v2, we need to provide data that's as good as that in order to satisfy our stakeholders. And with FullContact, we can actually look up by email address and find things like what organizations are you in, what is your LinkedIn profile, and things like that. And that's very helpful to then pass on to the marketing folks. We also look at MaxMind for your IP address, and you get the location of you based off of the IP address instead of asking you. This is kind of an obvious thing, but a lot of our forms still asked people, even though I believe it's 99.98% accurate to the country level based off of their tests. And over 90% accurate to the state level in the United States. So it's actually very helpful data for us to pass on, and it just allows us to have that frictionless experience for the users by gathering this data through their IP address. So what are all the features? You've seen some of them, so I'm going to go through pretty quickly this section. We started a little late. So social sign-in, you saw that. We initially launched with a couple providers, and we added LinkedIn after the launch to try to really encourage the business folks to sign in that way, as opposed to creating a username and password, which they're also able to do. The code snippets are fantastic to get up and running really quickly, and we have it in some of these languages. We can certainly add more. There are hidden sandboxes. These hidden sandboxes provide us a way to do workshops, whether training or things like NICAR. Will went to the NICAR conference, a data journalism conference, and had a workshop for them. And these hidden sandboxes, basically, we give you a URL that you visit. That puts something into your local storage, and then the sandbox will display that particular use case in addition to the normal public use cases. We added that streaming Twitter sandbox that uses OAuth permissions from Twitter, and you can only use this if you log in using Twitter. In the future, we might allow you to upgrade and grant additional permissions even if you log in with another provider. But everyone should check that out because it's data that they're interested in. It's data about them and their community. So definitely encourage you to check that one out. We also added an Nginx proxy for SSL. This is something you might not have seen very visibly, but you can see the top URL here is a proxied URL. That is the local internal address of your sandbox on the EC2 network, and then you have the direct HTTP URL. You'll notice that the direct HTTP URL, so we're generating random ports. This is how Docker and ECS work. We have random ports that are generated for each user because we have so many users on a machine. And those random ports are really high numbered ports that don't go through many corporate firewalls. We also wanted to add SSL support while having a valid SSL certificate. So we put this, an Nginx proxy for SSL in front of the sandbox, and that accomplishes both of those goals. We're on a standard port 443, and we have a valid SSL certificate, and then it proxies that traffic through to your actual Neo4j instance. The single sign-on to Neo4j browser is something you might not have noticed. You didn't have to type a password. If you click on the sandbox and then you click on the first page, the intro page, and you click on launch your Neo4j browser, you don't actually have to type in a password. So this is done using a variety of different technologies. We used a custom auth plugin, which was a feature added in one of the later releases of Neo4j. And that custom auth plugin validates a JOT, or a JSON Web Token, from auth0. Make sure that you are the person that's allowed to access that particular sandbox, and then sends back an OK and logs you into your Neo4j browser. You still have the credentials that you can access for when you're writing code and you want to send credentials. And you also have the credentials if you want to directly access it. But we wanted this really smooth experience, so that's all powered by auth0 and OAuth and such. We wanted email nurturing. We wanted to guide you along your path of using the sandbox. Right now, we just have a couple messages that we send out. We'll probably add some more instructional content along that way. But you get a note when you sign up for the sandbox. Everyone, please share out on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and such if you really like this. There's buttons there for you to do that. And then you get a link when your sandbox is about to expire, encouraging you to extend your sandbox by providing a little bit more information about your use case for Neo4j. And then lastly, you get something when your sandbox actually expires. So what's the architecture of all of this look like? I did a nifty diagram. So this nifty diagram is the overall architecture of the Neo4j sandbox. This doesn't have every component. As you saw in the tech stack, there are tons more components here. But you can see that, up here, do a little green screen action. Up here, you can see all of the different EC2 container services machines. So these are regular EC2 machines. Each of these are regular EC2 machines, and they are EC2 machines that are running the ECS image on it, and they're in this cluster of machines that process sandbox instances. We have fairly large machines on each of these, so you can get about 16 sandboxes per machine. And you'll notice that some of the machines, we have 3 machines that will always also have that Neo4j proxy, the Nginx image on it. So the Nginx image is on 3 of the machines. It can scale out indefinitely. I think, we have 20 or 30 or something like that physical machines right now. And each instance of your sandbox is actually 2 tasks. One is to import your data, whether that's to copy a file over from S3 of the actual database data, or whether that's to actually import it using Cypher. And then another one is your actual database. And all of this, the front end is just JavaScript that is hosted on a CloudFront CDN to S3. And that JavaScript then can access the API gateway to go to the Lambda functions for running instances, for stopping instances, for getting the status, etc. EC2 AutoScaling is on the right. We have alarms set up based off of the CPU reservation and the memory reservation and some few things to deal with big spikes. And that will create more EC2 machines for us to host these containers on. All of this sits on top of the identity and authorization layers provided by auth0, as well as IAM on the AWS side, and then your Neo4j database. So lessons learned. Quotas. This is actually a lesson I learned in the first version of the Twitter app. It got onto the front page of Hacker News, but I ran out of my EC2 quotas. There's a quota on the number of cores that you can launch in EC2 that's not always that visible. So if you're going to launch a big application, I encourage you to check that out. And the other place where quotas hit us, Some other place quotas hit us, but we'll skip that for now. Balancing load spikes smartly. So we were using smaller instances of Neo4j originally, and we were packing using the bin pack algorithm of ECS those instances as new Neo4j sandboxes started up. The problem this would happen, though, is in a spike, you'd have all 4 instances on one of these smaller machines starting up at the same time. And starting up Neo4j takes a little bit more CPU than operating it on an ongoing basis, and these instances were getting pretty crowded. So what we changed is to distribute the load across a bunch of different machines instead of packing it in. And we started using larger machines where we had a little bit more room to grow in terms of our CPU usage. I also needed to we started off with just using CloudWatch. I ended up needing to use Papertrail as well to provide more of a live view as I could see what's happening on the sandbox. And I experienced a lot of CSS hell. As I said, I'm not a front-end person by design, but I had to do a bunch of CSS here, and I was embedding Bootstrap into our WordPress templates, into whatever else, and there's a bunch of different libraries included. So I ended up having to actually namespace all of my CSS, and there's some great tools out there through Grunt, I think, and others to do that namespacing, but it was just another technology I had to figure out. But coding is rewarding. This is a screenshot. I'll move over here. You see 449 running tasks. What's next? Other than we only have 3 minutes left, and I'm sure there's a bunch of Q&A, we will last a couple minutes longer so that we could take questions. But let me just quickly review what's next for the sandbox, as this might answer some of your questions. First of all, the darker use cases are the ones that we have today. So we have 5 different use cases that are public today. We want to add more. We want to add in the bring your own data category. We want to add integrations with Google Spreadsheets to bring data from there. Integrations with arrows to feature some of the work that Michael Hunger has done to make it really easy to create graphs with arrows. In the API data, we're looking at adding GitHub data so that you can explore your GitHub commits. And on enterprise side, our first one is going to be network and IT ops, but we're also working on fraud detection and a variety of other more kind of enterprise business use cases. So definitely let us know what you'd like to see. And we will be opening it up so that we can get some use cases from you, some sandboxes from you. We haven't figured out the format of that yet, or how we're going to solicit those. Probably in the form of some type of a competition, like we've had the GraphGist competitions. But look out for that. We'll probably figure that out in the next month or two, and a way that you can kind of submit your own sandboxes, whether they be public or whether they be private. So we'll figure it out. Basically, all the sandboxes are is a data set and a guide, as well as the code snippets that you need and the data model. So it's a very simple set of things that you need to provide. The guides are all built in HTML, and you can use some build tools as well to build it from, I was going to say Markdown or DocBook, but it's neither of those. ASCII Doc. Thank you, Will. Sorry about that. We actually work closely with the ASCII Doc authors, so greatly apologize there. But anyway, you can build your guides from that as well, and it's an easy way to build your guides. We have the backup option in the menu, but we don't currently give you that backup. That's going to be something that we have in the future, so you can bring it onto your local machine, and you can run that Neo4j data that you had from your sandbox on your local machine. We also want to add deploy options so that you can then later deploy that onto a new sandbox or deploy that onto your own EC2 instance or Azure instance. We just launched in the Azure Marketplace. And you can deploy that data onto those cloud instances as you move from testing out Neo4j to using it in serious development and production. We also want to add social sharing with colleagues and friends where it sends out a link. You get the idea, a link with a token and that sort of thing. And this is going to require a little bit work on the JOT side and how we communicate the authorization data from Auth0 over to the sandbox, but I'm really looking forward to implementing this. Right now, shared out on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and that sort of thing, but in the future, we'll have an ability that you can share it directly. For now, you can also copy and paste the username and password, as well as the IP address and port from the details tab and share that with a colleague. All right, so it is exactly 10 o'clock. I used up all of my time and your time for Q&A technically, but I'm going to at least last for 5 minutes here. Hopefully, Will can switch over to our Slack channel and we can look at some of the questions that you folks have. Well, it doesn't look like we have a huge number of questions in the Slack channel. Some people might be asking questions in the YouTube live stream, which maybe Will can take a look at as well. But you can log on to the Slack channel, neo4j.com/Slack. There are about 5,000 graphistas on there. Definitely encourage you folks to check that out. See, up there. Encourage you to check that out. And we're in the Neo4j online meetup channel inside of the Neo4j users Slack. And I guess there's one question here. Will, do you want to read that question?
Sure. So we have a question here. Hi, everyone. I'm new to Neo4j, but would be interested to hear if someone is using with natural language and use cases around that.
And actually, Will, I'm going to have you answer that question because you have done the most work with natural language processing and Neo4j. So go ahead and answer, Will.
Sure. So I think there are lots of interesting use cases around NLP or natural language processing with Neo4j. I think the most natural fit is around entity extraction and topic extraction around content. So if you think of if you're building a article recommender system for maybe news articles, something like that, recommendations is a very common use case for Neo4j. And one thing you want to do with content recommendation is to be able to extract entities, extract topics from that. So I think that's the use case that most fits well when we're talking about NLP with graphs in Neo4j. I did a webinar a while ago. If you search on our YouTube channel for natural language processing with graphs, I think you'll see some of that as well. And there are other people doing some interesting projects around that as well. So we can certainly share some of those resources with you.
Just a minor interruption. My partner Marissa just sent me a picture of my 1-year-old baby watching this meetup. Whoa, there you go. So that's my 1-year-old baby watching this meetup on a big screen. Hopefully she will become an amazing developer, much better than myself. I look forward to that. Okay, so it doesn't look like we have any other questions in Slack, or maybe some are coming.
We're actually not capturing here the live updates from Slack, so we do have a few coming in. So let me just go ahead and read out a couple of questions here. So Howard is asking if you can tell us a bit more about what you're doing with MaxMind.
Sure. Basically, all I'm doing with MaxMind is looking up the IP address which you access the sandbox from and determining your location based off of that, and then associating that location with your record in our database. And what that allows us to do is invite you to local events and things along those lines. And it's really important for our marketing team to be able to do that. So I'm doing it at actually a fairly coarse grain. I'm just doing the country for most places and doing the state as well for the United States. And passing that on through. MaxMind actually does provide much more detail accuracy down to like zip code and such, which is actually correct for me. I don't know if it's correct for other folks, but I'm currently kind of throwing that data away right now and just using kind of the country and state level.
Great. Moving on to another question here from David. how many people and how long did this take to build? And how many people does it take to operate?
Sure. So basically, the infrastructure side, everything but the content was me. And that was, I don't know, I want to say 6 months in a part-time-ish capacity to build that, maybe a little bit more. I already did have experience working with Docker and with ECS and obviously Neo4j, so that certainly helped. But you know, 6 to 9 months in a part-time capacity. We'll say 20 hours a week. Some weeks it was 60 or 80 hours. Other weeks, I was busy in meetings all the time. But so that was on the actual infrastructure side. The content side was actually built by a lot of other folks. I referenced the recommendations guide that was built by Will. Will also did a lot of the Legisgraph and Trump world stuff along with some of the other folks on our team. I managed to do the graphics in Illustrator. That took me forever since I'm not a graphics person. So a lot of these things that I had new skills that I had to pick up were actually the things that took the most time. But it was team effort. The content is really what people are there for. They want to see the data. They want to see the guides. And a lot of folks on our team are working on that.
Cool. And another question here from Chris. Are there any plans to use the sandbox from a GraphGIST?
Sure. So there was a second part to that other question that I'll answer. And that the last question, the second part of it was how many people does it take to operate? I have had near zero challenges with operating the sandbox after the first week after it launched. So the first week, I was still trying to figure out how to do all the scaling and the packing algorithms and things like that. And then we did have the one day where AWS or the internet was out in the US East 1. That caused a little bit of heartache, but there was nothing I could do about that. So in a way, that was good because I didn't spend a lot of my time trying to solve that. But other than that, it's just been running smoothly. So the next thing was, are there plans to make GraphGIS into sandboxes? Absolutely. So Michael, I believe, has done work on making GraphGIS into Neo4j guides, which are basically those HTML guides that are displayed in the browser. And that's really what sandboxes require. So we're looking at various things, of course, to try to kind of merge these two projects. We're also looking at powering GraphGIS using sandboxes with a little bit more caching so that the GraphGIS don't take 80 to 400 seconds to load in some cases for the GraphGIS. But for those of you who aren't familiar with GraphGIS, check out neo4j.com/graphgis, GraphGISTS. And that is where you can find a bunch of people from the community who have contributed guides for working with Neo4j for a variety of different use cases, some serious business use cases, some things like Star Wars. So check that out. It's basically data models, and it's very, very small data sets to work with those use cases, whereas the sandbox is now focusing on larger data sets and a little bit more in-depth guides.
Great. And another question here from Mario. Mario says, how much memory and CPU does it take to run a single sandbox instance?
Sure. Thank you, Mario. I will say, by the way, that when I put together these slides, I realized I could actually do like 5 presentations on this if I go into detail. I would love to be able to show code and things like that, but just didn't have enough time. On the configuration side, we have them on, let's see here. I think there's 16 gigs of memory for each instance. We allocate 768, so 16 gigs of memory for each machine. We allocate 768 megs of memory to each Neo4j sandbox. But that is kind of how much is reserved for that sandbox. If one sandbox is larger and goes above that, it has some leeway to go above that to put more into its cache and things along those lines. And on the CPU side, again, we reserve very little. We reserve a quarter of a CPU, I believe, per sandbox instance. Sorry, a quarter of a core. But since I'm spreading these things evenly over all the machines, some of the sandboxes sandbox machines are actively being used while others are a little bit more idle. So we take advantage of that. And every sandbox can spike up to however much it needs, provided that there are no other sandboxes need that CPU on that machine.
Okay, maybe we'll take just one more question here. So a question from D. Holtz. This looks like a good first step toward a push-button cloud-hosted Neo4j. Any plans for that coming up in the future?
I'm not here from the product team. I'm here from developer relations. Our goals are entirely different than what the product team goals are in some ways. Obviously, they want you to use the product and have a good experience. But we're kind of adding these levels on top of it, adding these UX features on top of it. So not sure what's going to happen in terms of the cloud with Neo4j. You can keep an eye out for at future Graph Connects, and that's where we tend to do most of our announcements nowadays. So I would watch Graph Connect videos and watch our blog posts around Graph Connect times if you want to see kind of where the product is going. And Emil always does a keynote and does give quite a few hints as far as where we are going as a company and as a product. So check that out. And in the meantime, use the Neo4j Sandbox, and you can feel free to reach out to me at RyGuyRG on Twitter or ryan@neo4j.com on email. And of course, I should have the URL for the sandbox on here, but that's neo4j.com/sandbox. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for the amazing questions, and thank you, Will, for manning our Q&A, and I greatly appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing what everyone does with the sandbox. Share out your projects. Share out what you end up building on the sandbox. We'd love to see it. Thanks.